Minister. Prime Minister, with the sixth current account deficit over $2 billion in a row, with a forecast current account deficit next year as bad as this year, will you now concede you have dismally failed again on the balance of payments, or is this as good as it ever gets?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
As our savings go up with super, which you oppose, it gets better and better.
Mr Speaker, the government made very clear in the budget that the growth in the current account deficit was unacceptable to the country, to the government, and that we needed to see the budget come back into surplus to contribute to public savings, and also to indicate that the government had a plan to add to long-term savings in superannuation by every person in the Australian workforce contributing up to 15%, or at least 15% of his or her income. Now, Mr Speaker, you may by well now know that the Treasury is estimating that that by 2020 there is a 4% addition to GDP from savings and super, and by the year 2000, and by the year 2000, 2% of GDP additional savings. That's around $10 billion, which would make a substantial contribution to the general savings task, bearing in mind, Mr Speaker, that the budget itself is coming back into a strong surplus from a deficit, from a deficit of around $12 billion in the next couple of years to a surplus coming around $7 billion. As a consequence, there is another 3 or 4% of GDP there. So, Mr Speaker, I've made clear in addresses around the country that at least if we look at the budget, there's a good solid 2 to 3 percentage points of savings there, and 2 percentage points coming from superannuation. Now, Mr Speaker, that is way beyond the capacity of anything they could do on the other side of the House. They have no policy on superannuation, and in fact, Mr Speaker, let me say that the Leader of the Opposition in his budget reply said, "I can say to those same people that on a change of government any existing retirement benefit will be preserved." In other words, it will not rise as part of a 15% scheme. We'll introduce, as promised during the last election, a retirement savings account. In other words, back to tax incentives, which he had when he was Treasurer, and of course never worked. Well, of course, never worked. Now, Mr Speaker, could I also say that in today's current account, it appears the deficit is flattening out in a trend sense, and it's likely that the deficit for the current year will be a little lower than the Treasury's prediction in the budget. And I might remind the House that in terms of capital goods, there's a 23.8% number. There's a 23.8% increase in capital goods. So it is the capital goods, Mr Speaker, which of course in the end...
Member for Casey.
It's the capital goods, Mr Speaker, that power along the productive capacity of the economy to actually meet these changes. I might remind the questioner that also in budget paper number 1 and statement 2, the Treasury referred to as Australian investment abroad, and it talks about our net foreign debt being around 37%, but it says Australian investment abroad increased.
Order.
Australian investment abroad, next to nothing. Next to nothing. Mr. Speaker,
the Deputy Leader of the Opposition will not interject.
Australian investment abroad increased from around 10% of GDP in the early 1980s to peak at 31% of GDP in September 1993. While this increase in overseas investment has been a welcome development reflecting the increasing internationalisation of the Australian economy, it contributed to higher levels of foreign debt as overseas borrowings were used to fund Australian equity investment abroad. Now, Mr Speaker, I just remind the House of the juxtaposition of those numbers. That is, our net foreign debt is 37% of GDP, but Australian investment abroad is 31% of GDP and was next to nothing in the early 1980s. So, in any analysis of the current account and our debt position, Mr Speaker, you never hear about the Australian assets abroad, or the fact that, as a consequence of the putting of those assets abroad, our debt has risen. So, Mr. Speaker, I just make that point. But the other, I think, more compelling point, perhaps another more compelling point, Mr. Speaker, is the Deputy Leader of the Opposition asked me a question about savings while he's saying he denies using any of the instruments of fiscal policy, and that is talking about. And there's a piece here by Mr. Colbatch from The Age, and he talks about the reference to George Bush's no new taxes. He says, well, guess what? Peter Costello, the Shadow Treasurer's unveiled the Coalition's platform, no tax rises. And he goes on to say, but the second pledge is that there'll be no tax rise. The no tax rise pledge cannot be reconciled. Order. Mr. Speaker, and this is the punchline. Cannot be reconciled with Mr. Costello's commitments also to produce a long-term budgetary surplus at the same time as delivering tax cuts to three huge groups: savers, family and self-funded retirees. In other words, Mr. Speaker, here they are talking about the current account and savings while saying they will not resort to any change in receipts, while at the same time saying they'll have long-term budgetary surpluses, while at the same time saying they'll deliver tax cuts to three groups: savers, families and self-funded retirees. Mr. Speaker, that, as Mr. Colbatch politely put it, this failure to reconcile is the key point about the opposition. There is no reconciliation between reality and their phobias. And so the Deputy Leader may well ask me what the answer is on the current account deficit and national debt, Mr. Speaker, but one thing is for sure, whatever it is, he hasn't got a clue.